Welcome to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Glad you could join us today. I'm happy to welcome Joseph Bouchard back to the program. Joseph has been on here before. He's a longtime contributor. And I'm going to, for the sake of people meeting you for the first time, Joseph, take a few moments and tell us just a little bit about who you are.
Well, thanks for having me again, Brian. It's great to be back. So for those who don't know me, I'm originally Canadian, but I've done a lot of work in Latin America as a journalist and as a researcher. I mostly cover crime, security, and geopolitics with an interest in policing, for example, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. And I've done this for about 4 years now.
Yeah, I'm looking at the title of your article. U.S. taxpayers are funding police brutality in Brazil. And this grabs my attention for a couple of reasons. I was telling you before we jumped on the air, the most violent videos I think I've seen in recent memory tend to come out of Brazil. And it's the police. I mean, oftentimes they're cracking down on, people trying to rob people on motorcycle or whatever. But holy cow, those police do not mess around. It's kind of scary.
That's right. They use quite extreme tactics. People love to talk about U.S. police brutality, but Brazil, which has 100 million people, fewer, actually more than that, than the U.S., has about 5 or 6 times the number of people killed, most of which are civilians. And as you said, they use very, very specific types of weapons that tend to not really, they tend to do a lot of damage, let's just say. And they really have no regard for any kind of civilian casualties or reputation or these kinds of things, or even rule of law. And it shows on the numbers.
So I have to ask this question because I really don't know. Why are things so violent there in Brazil? And it's not just the police. I've seen, some very violent, criminal activity, videos that come out, but their police, there's a whole different level. You mentioned the article, the militarization of them. Does it start there?
Well, the conflict really precedes militarization of police. That was sort of a response to that. During the military dictatorship and now in the recent decades, it's really ramped up. But in Brazil's case, it's mostly gang violence through very high levels of competition over turf, over drug markets and other illegal markets that then gets met with extreme levels of police violence, which really fuels a cycle of killings as a sort of daily occurrence to the point where it's thousands and thousands of people dying every day, and it's not really covered by the media anymore.
That makes it tough. I mean, essentially, I'm sorry if this sounds disrespectful, but it sounds like you have competing gangs. You have the government's gangs versus the other gangs, and it sounds like there's just no end to the escalation.
No, that's right. And I'm glad you brought up government's gangs because they are also involved in this. So they have these militarized police units which are supposed to fight gangs. But in recent decades, especially in Rio de Janeiro, governments have secretly backed militias, which are their own types of gangs, and they themselves engage in drug trafficking and illegal gambling rings, human trafficking, weapons smuggling rings. And they do a lot of damage to the point where in Rio, for example, they're now the dominant illegal force. And so governments have been funding these groups for their own benefit. A lot of them profit from these rings. A lot of police officers themselves work for illegal gangs. And so it's sort of a self-feeding cycle that never ends.
Okay, so I have to ask, too, because I don't know, the civilian population of Brazil, are they allowed firearms ownership or is that outlawed?
It's outlawed, but there's some tweaks. So in recent years, during the last government, not this current one, restrictions on firearm ownership and use were really loosened up. And it seemed like that was mostly going to be about self-defense and protection. And numbers point to a few thousand people owning firearms illegally. The number of illegal guns is still far outweighing the number of legal guns, but that might change in the next decades, depending on how the security situation goes and what kind of governments win. But it's nowhere near the U.S. numbers of millions and millions of guns.
And tell me about how the U.S. figures into this equation as far as arming Brazilian police.
That's right. So for years now, going back to the military dictatorship in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the U.S. has been involved in funding the military police, which is the biggest police organ in Brazil, and now the most powerful by far. And U.S. support for them continues. they do a lot of militarized training, rapid response teams, SWAT team training, as they would call it, selling weapons, doing joint training and these kinds of exercises, which then turn into violent responses by police to drug gangs, which turn into very high levels of civilian casualties, which is what I criticize in my report.
Yeah, and that's, I know people won't shed a lot of tears over the idea of, a violent gangster meeting a violent end, especially if it's, at the hands of police who are there to enforce law and order. But it sounds like there are a lot of innocent people that get caught in the crossfire here, or sometimes are actively targeted by police.
That's right. Well, the motto of the military police is a good criminal is a dead criminal, and they often like to tout this. And it's true that they do provide some kind of order, and they do deal with pretty bad people. But you can't forget that a lot of their raids are very militarized with these very high caliber weapons where they shoot indiscriminately into crowds or into neighborhoods that most often leads to civilian casualties. The last reporting I've seen shows that most casualties in these raids tend to be civilians. And oftentimes there's no judicial involvement in these processes where raids tend to be justified after the fact if there's any kind of outcry at all. Most often they're just not even reported. And that really causes an issue because it's not just criminals that are being targeted, it's everyday people.
Well, and that motto, again, I know at a gut level, some people will respond, "Oh, yeah, you're right. The only good criminal is a dead criminal." But who's making the determination of, hey, that looks like a criminal? And if it's a police officer, particularly one that's on hair trigger, kind of alert, it seems to me like that's a good way to whoops. Okay, well, sorry about that, but we got the wrong person.
No, that's right. And Brazil could actually learn quite a bit from the US from this and other countries, Western democracies, where, sure, police services are used rightfully so to go against criminals and drug traffickers and these pretty awful, violent people. And nobody's arguing against them. It's simply that there's a level of excess of violence and corruption within the police service that allows indiscriminate civilian killings to go unpunished. And we want accountability mechanisms and any kind of help to really go against this and regulate the police to make sure that they don't kill civilians.
So talk to me about the training as well as the weapons that the U.S. is providing. It sounds like the training is pretty militarized as well.
That's right. So the military police itself, their training is quite extreme. They talk about hazing in the U.S. Armed Forces and the police, but this is on another level. A lot of whistleblowers from the military police have exited and talked about the routine use of torture, different kinds of psychological and physical torture within training, and those specific tactics used during training have been used on suspects, most oftentimes civilians, thousands of cases of this, by the same military police officers who are taught these techniques.
Wow. So let's talk solutions. How can this situation be changed? Where does that begin?
Well, I would say the biggest thing would be for the U.S. to revise and review its policy and to perhaps use this leverage. It funds most of the weapons used by the military police. A lot of the training is given to military police by the U.S., and it can use this leverage to really change the policy and push for more accountability. And then domestically, there has to be more pushback from the local population, demand more change.
Okay. Like I say, I was vaguely aware of this on some levels, but I don't think I really fully started to appreciate how deep this problem is until looking at your article. Again, we're talking with Joseph Bouchard, who is a Young Voices contributor. Joseph, for those who wish to follow you or would like to see more of your work, what's the best way to find you on social media? Where can they find more of your writings?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at GeoPaulWonk, and I publish all my pieces there as well as miscellaneous takes and random things on Latin America and security. And I publish a column a week, which I'm looking forward to having you read.
All right. Very good. Good to catch up with you once again. If I don't see you before Christmas, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you.
Likewise, and to your family as well.
Thank you. Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Very happy to welcome back to the program Agustina Vergara Cid. She is joining us today from Southern California. And how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Brian. Thank you for having me again.
For the sake of people who are meeting you for the very first time, would you please take just a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I am a Young Voices contributor. I'm doing one of their programs now, and I'm an immigrant to the United States, and I'm very interested in immigration issues and immigration policy, and that's what I joined to talk about today.
Very good. I'm looking at an article you wrote for The Hill. Ideological vetting of immigrants is an awful idea. I'll admit I had not heard about the ideological vetting. I know immigration has been a huge issue both leading up to the election and now that the election is over. Talk to me about this proposed concept of ideologically vetting those who are coming into this country. Whose idea was that?
So it's not just like ideological vetting, because vetting is actually necessary. It's necessary for the government to vet who's going to be coming here to the United States. But the ground in which they uses to vet, like the standards for that vetting, is what's important. Because what we want to do is we want to exclude people who are threats to the rights of Americans, right? People who are terrorists or people who are seeking to come here and cause harm, or criminals, spies, foreign agents, and all those sort of people that actually are coming here to inflict harm into Americans or the country, or to overthrow the government and things like that. So people that actually take the action, the initiative to do that sort of thing, those people we want to keep out, and that's what the current law already keeps out. We have an immigration system. Our current immigration law exclude those sort of people from even visiting the United States. So what President Trump wants to implement, based on what he's been saying, is what he calls extreme vetting, which is the exclusion of people based on belief that the government doesn't like, essentially. So it's not only based on their actions or actual threats, like, oh, we know this guy is a terrorist or has been collaborating with terrorists abroad and that sort of thing, but it's based on the views that a person may have, right? As decided by the government. So it can potentially conflate dissent with danger.
Yeah, you point out in your article, and by the way, I do agree with this, when we allow government to start policing people's thoughts, it's not just going to affect the immigrants. This would very likely affect U.S. citizens as well.
Yes, I think so, because, well, there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the way that President Trump has been talking about this, he wants to implement this because he thinks that government has a role in telling the people in America what sort of ideas they should hold and what sort of ideas should be implemented politically. So what he wants to prevent is he thinks that there are many immigrants that come here and want to change the politics in America. You know, that myth that, the immigrants vote Democrat and that sort of thing, or they bring the socialism and communism. Factually, that's not true, and we've seen the number of Latinos that have voted for Trump in the last election. But it's interesting because he wants to vet the immigrants, and immigrants don't vote for a very long time until they become citizens, and that's not even mandatory to become a citizen. It's a long process. It's expensive. It takes many, many years. So it's not like someone coming here immediately, like next week, if there's an election, they're going to be able to vote. That's not the case. They have to become a citizen. And to become a citizen, there's like a whole test and process to prove your moral character and your knowledge of American institutions. So that is not a valid reason. But so if you start opening the door to government being this arbiter of morality and of ideology, part of what's going to happen is, first of all, you open the floodgates. So now you have given government this authority. And then if the government is actually interested in preventing some political change or something like that, the government would be much more interested in doing this for citizens who can actually vote and run for office and actually implement that political change.
You point to something that I think people need to consider when they hear about ideas like this. Well, we're going to keep out the people with the bad ideas. Other countries have done this. And you list three of them in particular: Venezuela, Cuba, and China have undertaken policies like this. What can we learn from their examples?
Yeah, so allegedly, so part of the objective of this extreme vetting policy is to keep the authoritarians away, right? But the problem is that this measure itself is what's authoritarian. So there are countries that are built essentially around, or that are sustained around thought control and having the government be the thought police, like Venezuela. I mean, dissent is crushed right there, right? Like, and there's like this ideology that people must follow, and if you don't follow, you better shut up and just just do what you're told. China, the amount of censorship and the one party, and you have to toe the party line, or otherwise you can probably even end up dead. It has been many cases before. Well, Soviet Russia back in the day, well, Russia today to a great extent as well. So we don't want to be implementing the policies, the authoritarian speech policies and thought policies of those countries. We want to let people have the ideas that they want, as long as they don't take really bad ideas into actions and they don't actually are seeking to cause harm. We want them to have free speech, and we want to have the opportunity to persuade those people, which is an important factor in this. When we're saying, oh, let's not bring bad ideas here, we're essentially admitting that the ideas that we currently have are kind of weak and they cannot stand up to these other ideas.
No, I absolutely agree. And there's that distinction between ideas and behavior. I've heard it said, and I agree with this thing. Look, anything peaceful in terms of what a person wishes to do, as long as it's peaceful, then it's okay. What's in their head, as long as their behavior is peaceful, is their business. So how likely is this to become a policy that is central to the incoming administration? I mean, I know it's a goal, but do they face hurdles that would prevent them from enacting it?
Yes, they face some hurdles. I think it's a betrayal of kind of like a deeply American principles and First Amendment principles. And even outside of First Amendment, I think that Americans hold their free speech they take it very seriously. And if they understand, I mean, no one is, I'm not trying to say that people should, say, oh, a communist, like there's no risk. There's nothing wrong that a communist can bring here. Bad ideas are dangerous, and good ideas are really have a lot of positive impact, right? So ideas have power, but that power is counteracted with better ideas, right? So we have, if someone who has a socialist leaning, and I actually know people that for whom this was true, they can come here and see the freedom in America, and it's the job of the intellectuals and the communicators to teach people and to try to persuade people that these ideas are the best ideas in the world, which they are. And like I was saying, I know personally people who have come here with kind of like left-leaning ideas in their head, and they have immigrated here and are now advocates for capitalism, actual advocates for capitalism. I have a friend who's a very famous speaker in favor of capitalism. So I think that's part of what's key here.
Okay. You make a very strong case here. Look, bad ideas do exist, but the antidote is not to try to prevent them from being heard. It's to make sure that better ideas can also be heard, which means you've got to be able to risk hearing the bad ones in order to also be able to hear the good ones. That shouldn't be such a hard sell, but it sounds like there would be resistance, right?
Yeah, and I think it's lack of faith in, or not faith, but like trust in the power of American ideals. And it's true that we all need to be defending them. Some people like more with more fervor and everywhere. But it's true that these are the best ideas in the world, and they can persuade basically anyone. Again,
we are speaking with Agustina Vergara Cid. She is a Young Voices contributor, and I thank you for, first of all, bringing our attention to this. Where can people find you on social media? Where can they find more of your work?
So they can Google me, and my website will pop up, and then on X, my X account will pop up as well. It's Agustina V. Cid on X, and then Instagram is the same handle.
Very good. Have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
All right, thank you. You too, Ryan.
And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Noah Gould back to the program. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Noah, for those who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, thanks, Brian. Always great to be on the show. My name is Noah Gould, as you mentioned. I work at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I run our alumni and student programs and contribute to a variety of publications. And I'm also a contributor with Young Voices.
I'm looking at an article that you wrote for lawliberty.org. Is higher education inherently political? And I know how I would answer that question today, but I'm not sure I would say definitely, but I don't think that's always been the case, has it?
No, I mean, there's been ebbs and flows of this topic, and this article was actually published as a symposium of two pieces in Law and Liberty. So it's kind of fun to read my article and then the opposing article as well, written by Scott Yenor. But my case is basically that we need to put the political part of education, because there's certainly a part in its proper place within the context of education as a whole. So I think we've seen ebbs and flows of how political higher education becomes. We're certainly kind of at a high point now in how politicized that debate has become.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I have kids that are in higher education, and you would think this would be on my radar screen, but I don't think I've given it really the close scrutiny that it deserves. Now, I have it in my mind that higher education is pretty much a captive institution in terms of progressivism. Has it? Talk to me about that, though. Is that necessarily the case? Are there some very notable exceptions to progressive ideology ruling the roost at some institutions of higher learning?
Yeah, that's right. So what a lot of people know is that when you look at kind of the balance of politics in the academy, it skews to the left pretty heavily. So at the most kind of conservative, if you will, estimates, there's double the amount of liberal or progressive faculty as there are conservative faculty. And that actually might be underestimating the problem, as some others show that it's really just a tiny amount of conservative faculty, and then there's some moderates and then a lot of liberal faculty. So that's kind of what everyone knows, is that the academy skews to the left. Now, there are a few exceptions, especially in the past few years, that have been propping up to kind of give an alternative to what is a pretty dominant progressive space. So I kind of break them down into three categories that we've seen recently. One is religious schools that are really saying, hey, our doctrines are conservative, so let's really kind of make sure our identity stays this way. These are places like Hillsdale, or my alma mater is Grove City College. They kind of are in this general religious conservative space. And a lot of them more recently have made sure to clarify their identity in those terms. And then a second category is kind of what you might call classical liberal. So these are like pro-free speech startups like UATX, University of Austin, Texas, is kind of just started its first class this year. There's people on the left and right that are working together to kind of create a free university. So that's really on the cusp of just starting. We'll see where that goes next. And then the third category that my article focuses on, and a lot of the controversy has been on, is public institutions. So these are in different state systems around the country. Florida is certainly the most well-known of the New College of Florida and others. DeSantis and his administration is basically saying, hey, let's rewrite the identity of these institutions to be a more politically active conservative institution. So this is where the debates come in of what should the role of politics be in higher education.
And I hate to ask this, but I have to wonder, was there ever a time when politics had a lesser influence and it was really more about the pursuit of knowledge, or has that always been, part and parcel of public or of higher education rather, to struggle with trying to, keep things balanced politically, or to contend with, ideological takeover?
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons that this has become more politicized is the scale. So Russell Kirk, conservative philosopher and writer, famously left Michigan State, called it Behemoth U when he left, basically saying that the scope of education he really wasn't able to teach. So there's more and more people who are entering education, entering, not just high school, but completing a college degree. And so that, I think, has an effect on who has an interest. If everyone is going through higher education, then there's going to be more politicization.
So is it safe to say that maybe the better solution isn't so much let's get the government involved here and get a solution imposed? Because it seems like no matter how how well intended they may be, if it's government doing it at some level, it's got to feel heavy-handed to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we really zoom out and say, what's the purpose of education, that helps us to put that in context, right? Because if the purpose of education is just to create workers, right, then that has a specific outcome. But if the purpose is really much broader, forming humans, forming people who are able to interact in a free society, people who are able to build families, people who are able to contribute to their churches, contribute to community groups, this is a much more expansive, vision of education. And so in this case, I am extremely skeptical of efforts to kind of impose politics into higher education in a really heavy-handed way. Not to say that progressives aren't already doing this. I'm fully clear-eyed on that this is already happening, but I think that our efforts would be better. Anyone who's interested in higher education and forming people should think about what are the incentives and how can we shift a mentality away from, hey, what government bureaucrat wants me to do. And we can talk more about funding. That's a real key here. But what does that government bureaucrat want me to do to, hey, what are the other stakeholders like churches, like families, like local communities, local governments as well. Not everything is a federal government problem or a state government problem. So there are a lot of different stakeholders here, and they all, I think, should have some say and be able to have some play in that space.
You actually make a great point in this article, too, about I know that people, we need a counterbalance, so let's have a very conservative kind of, influence, in a particular institution of higher learning. But a conservative echo chamber is still kind of doing the same thing that a progressive echo chamber is doing, and that is limiting the discourse and limiting the perspective of the people who are part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and maybe the conservative faction that you're a part of may not be in power there, right? It's not just there's all these different factions and power struggles. And so that's what we really need to care about is we don't want a whiplash of back and forth between this political party in power, this other political party in power. And I get really worried when we think about, okay, how are we actually dipping into the classroom? That's I think the biggest concern. Maybe we can appoint good people to public institutions if you think that they need to exist. But as much as we dip in and try to meddle with the day-to-day, that's when we're really going to get political fights that are unnecessary.
Yeah, it's. I think you make a very good case for, look, if it's about learning, maybe politics are better kept out of it. This is just my personal opinion, but everything that politics touches seems to become a tug of war pretty quickly. So the less we can, or the more we can minimize politics' influence on a given institution, it seems like the less contention there's going to be over what's going on within that institution.
Absolutely. And if you think of the college debt problem is a problem that is produced by not allowing families and students to kind of have a decision over what is important to them. And so government influence in that way hasn't helped. So a lot of other past problems that we've tried to solve in higher education through that interference haven't worked out. So I think we should just be wary about that government intrusion and the incentives it creates. And because I don't want, like you said, mentioning where do you want to send your kids, sending them to a place where they're formed to be kind of for a much broader vision rather than a narrow political forming.
Again, we are talking with Noah Gould. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Noah, for those who would like to follow your excellent writings, where can they do so and where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, so on X, my username is Noah C. Gould 1. I'd love to connect there. And as Brian, as always, it's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Okay, thank you so much. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you as well.
Same to you and your family. All right, goodbye.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Matthew Cookson back to the program. Matt, you're an old pro. You've been on here many a time, but for those meeting you for the first time, take just a second to tell us a little bit about yourself and about your background.
Well, thanks for having me on again, Brian. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. I currently work in the supply chain industry, but public policy and politics are a passion of mine. Love to write on the topic and stay up to the news and, make conservative policies heard.
Well, I'm looking at an op-ed that you wrote for Chalkboard News about Texas must promote philosophical freedom through school choice. This is a topic that is on a lot of people's minds. Even I live in Idaho, and school choice is a big issue here as well. Talk to me about where does Texas stand on school choice? Is this is it something they're grappling with? Is it something that they have accomplished at some level?
Well, this is something that's been a big priority for Governor Abbott going back a couple of years now. We've seen school choice come in the form of ESAs and a variety of different policies across the country in Florida and Arizona and West Virginia. And Governor Abbott really wants Texas to be the next place for that to spring forth. Now, there hasn't been any type of educational saving accounts or vouchers or anything like that. And that was something that the governor was really hoping would become law in Texas in the last legislative session. Unfortunately, that did not happen.
So where did the opposition come from for that? Was it the teachers' unions primarily, or were there other political players, like legislators who fought against this?
Yeah, teachers' unions are for sure one of the opponents of school choice, but there is the also deeply emotional appeal that a lot of opponents to school choice make, which is concerns for rural schools. There obviously a lot of Texas is rural, a lot of people living out in smaller towns, and people are concerned that school choice or ESAs would negatively affect the few school options they do have and lead to school closures. Thankfully, we do have test cases in this area. We've seen Arizona go down the school choice road a few years now, and opponents of school choice there were trying to ring the alarm that rural school districts would come and collapse as a result of shifting funds around. But thankfully, we've seen that not to be the case. So I think Texas should be the next state to enact school choice.
So let's talk a little bit about philosophical freedom in terms of how does that term apply here? Are we talking for the students, or are we talking for their parents?
I think we're talking both. Raising your children how you want is something that I think every parent deeply values. And as people at places like the Cato Institute point out, one way or another, you are going to be forced into ideological conflicts over values in school, because at some level, you do need to choose a value system that you're teaching at school. And if you do not allow parents and students to choose schools that align with their values, you are denying them a fundamental right to educate their child how they best think.
Wow. I just know that every state that I have followed this issue in, there's serious misgivings about how school choice should look. And I'm curious, in Texas, do you have people saying, well, look, you can have choice, but it needs to take place within the public school system? In other words, we'll just work within the public school system to create whatever choice you want. Do you hear rumblings of anything like that?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I know as far as the bill that Governor Abbott and other Republicans are trying to push in the legislature in the previous session and going into the next one is focus on ESAs, which are education savings account. And how that would work is there would be a set amount of money in that account for parents to spend on how they see fit. Now, they can use that money on public schooling, but there are other things that go along with education that parents are in need of, whether it's tutoring or their student has a special need that they have a specific program in mind that they want to be a part of, or transportation to a school district that they really want to be a part of, but because of distance, they cannot get to. So using an ESA is one of the options that for transportation is one of the things that it can be used for.
I know one of the things that I hear opponents of school choice bring up is, well, where is the accountability? Where's the oversight going to come from? Now, my understanding is that there is oversight even through these education savings accounts. In that, is there not some kind of government entity that basically assures that, okay, so this is being spent, even if it's on homeschool curriculum or whatever, but it is being spent on educational activity and not, I don't know, lawn flamingos or something.
For sure, yeah. Part of any government program, which is what this is ensuring that there's accountability. And the legislature owes it to the taxpayers of the state of Texas to ensure that money can only be spent for educational purposes. As you said, we don't want people misusing money and spending it at the golf course or whatever. There need to be strict guardrails in place to ensure that this money can only be spent on educational items and not misused for non-school related expenses.
What is your take on tuition tax credits, where the money never actually leaves the pockets of the parents, but instead they're given credit on their taxes? So therefore, I guess there's less strings attached to that money, so long as it's being spent, again, on educational activities.
Well, it certainly removes some of the controversy associated with tying actual dollars and cents to accounts. And I think it is definitely a creative way to give Texas parents flexibility in terms of where they send their student to school. Maybe some want to send their child to a religious school or another form of a private school. Giving them a break on their taxes is another good way to allow flexibility and choice in schooling.
So is there any other state that states like Texas can look to as an example of what is working? It seems like Arizona has had some pretty decent school choice for a while. Has it been enough time that they have a track record that they can point to and say, see, this is how it works?
Well, this whole movement is pretty young, but you're correct that Arizona is pretty much the gold standard when it comes to school choice and how this whole labyrinth of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of different experimentations in terms of school choice. And while this movement is young, Arizona does have the longest experience with this movement, and Texas should definitely look to places like Arizona and West Virginia and Florida in terms of what's been working and what hasn't, and be the greatest country in America, as we Texans like to say.
Well, if anybody's going to get it right, I would trust Texas rather to take it seriously and do so. Governor Abbott, he's been in for a while. Is he still? I don't know what his status is. Is he a long timer in terms of office, or is his term coming up for re-election?
Well, I do know that he is heavily invested in this fight, and in the short term, for sure, it is his priority to ensure that this issue gets pushed through. I know there's a lot of controversy in this fight. Governor Abbott has been playing political hardball in terms of approving additional funding for schooling, so there is incentive on both sides to come to some sort of a deal to get this thing approved.
Well, I will be watching anxiously from Idaho, which also will be working very hard to get school choice through. And are there any other states that this is going to be kind of a pivotal, issue for as in the upcoming legislative sessions after the first of the year?
Well, you mentioned Idaho, which of course has been battling with this issue for a number of years, but this is an issue that is blowing up all over the country. This wasn't on anyone's radar really 10 years ago, but now it's starting to spring up all over the place, and parents are realizing how much of an issue this really is and how important it is for them to be invested in the policies concerning schools.
Well, I know there's a saying out there, there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come, so fingers crossed, maybe this is the time when it all comes together. Again, we're talking with Matt Cookson. Matt is a Young Voices contributor and wears a few other hats as well. Where can people follow you, Matt, on social media? Where can they find you writing?
Yeah, that's correct. So I'm on X. You can follow me at Matt Cookson95 to see the works that I've been getting published. And thanks again for having me on the show, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you.
You as well.